Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of nationality, national identity, national origin. How do we determine it? How should it be defined? Is the globalist view, which is being forced upon us without our consent, is the globalist view that whoever is born anywhere becomes that nationality? So, somebody from anywhere in the world, darkest Africa or Asia or anywhere can be English, provided they're born in England. That's it. They're English. They may not speak a word of English. They may not integrate at all. They may live in an enclave exclusively made up by people of their genetic origin. They may identify as of their genetic origin, but according to the globalists, no, that person is English or Swiss or wherever. Now, for countries that have a high migration rate, this of course is a much bigger problem than for countries that have either no outside migration, or the migration is tied to those that speak the language and are on, say, short-term work visas, things like that. I was surprised at how many Western people, I mean, there's not a lot, but more than you'd expect, Western people are working in Japan, and particularly women with red hair and freckles. They seem to be in high demand in Japan. But they're still required to have some sort of competence in, say, restaurants or hospitality. They must speak competent Japanese and so on. So there's still a bar you have to get over, even for a short-term work visa. And the Japanese are quite strict on that. Again, even it's from people in the area like Koreans, because quite a few Koreans speak very good Japanese, but even they have to jump hurdles and so on. And I've known people in Japan who say they've got because Korea used to be part of the Japanese Empire, where the father is Japanese but the mother was Korean. And I was talking to a lady there, and she says they just never fully accept you into Japanese society because she's half Korean. And according to Japanese people that I know, you apparently can tell somebody who's not fully Japanese or part Korean or part whatever. One guy was telling me that there was a worker in the office, a young woman who their father, one of their parents was Filipino, the other was Japanese, and he could pick them and I couldn't. It didn't seem obvious to me, but they can. Maybe in the same way that I can look at someone and say, well, gee, they're probably French or they're probably Danish or something. There's certain sort of subtle characteristics you get to identify. So maybe it's the same with them, but I can't identify those same characteristics, being an outsider in that sense. But coming back, what makes someone, I use English as just an example because it's in a fair bit around the media at the moment. So there's a lot of commentators saying, no, if you're born in England, it doesn't matter what your genetic origin is, you're now English and that's it. Whether you integrate or assimilate or speak a word, irrelevant. You're born there, you're now English, done. Now there's a lot who would disagree with that, but let's sort of go through sort of the timeline, if you will. Nationality was more a city-state thing or a tribal thing. I mean, in the time of hunter-gatherers, I guess there was no nation-states or nationalities, and even tribes would have been quite minor affairs, given again a roaming hunter-gatherer sort of lifestyle. But having a look at once people started settling down with agriculture, you'd have tribes. These developed into in sedentary sort of existence terms. They would develop into city-states, say Athens, ancient Athens, and Rome. Ancient Rome began as a city-state, then grew into an empire. But the idea was you would get Roman citizenship, so they still had a city-state architecture, to what we could say was loosely based on national identity. The idea of an Italian identity was really pretty vague back in the Roman times, even though Rome sort of had in Italian terms at least, had a very stable empire boundaries for 500 plus years. So you think that would have created an Italian identity, but it didn't really. If you looked at, say, southern Italy and Sicily, they still referred to those people as really the Greeks, because they've been they were primarily a Greek during those times, or had come from the days of the Greek traders or even the Carthaginian Arabic traders before that. Looking at as societies developed and evolved, the idea of the modern nation state that would contain in it similar tribes. For example, when France became a nation, they still had a lot of different tribes, and you can see from the name Normandy. So those people were settled primarily by Scandinavians, and then there was Brittany. The British people from the British Isles, the Celtic folks, and then when the Romans came, they sort of somewhat Romanized Gaul. But then during the days of the Holy Roman Empire, the Frankish German tribes moved in, and that's why the Germans refer to France as Frankreich, the country of the Franks. So the nation state, modern nation state, developed. I suppose you could say 1500s and later it started to come together. Maybe a little bit earlier, but around that time, and that's when it meant something to be English or to be French or to be of the Germanic tribes or to be Spanish or so on. So now that didn't mean there weren't others in there. In for example, after the reconquest of Spain from the Moors, the Arabic Moors, there was still a lot of Moors that were there, or other people that had come in with the Moors as traders, Jewish traders, for example. So there was still a hodgepodge there, but the idea of the nation state was being born. Now, looking at the development of England as a case in point, you've got initially the Celtic Gaelic tribes there, and there's even some differences there, and they're very, very tribal and regional, and they're constantly at war with each other. The Cornish tribes in what today's modern day Cornwall, seeing themselves as distinct and different. Now, I guess part of the idea of it being distinct and different is people didn't travel that much. The amount of people that travelled, traders with trading boats, for example, the amount of people travel were very few. So most people, nearly all the people tended to be born, lived and died on a village. They may not travel any more than 5 miles from where they were born. This is so you can acquire, or a group of people who can acquire habits and even use of language and all sorts of things, or things that are peculiar to that area or that climate. How they grow their food and how they look after their animals and all this sort of thing can all be affected by sticking in the one place, the one area, and not really moving outside of it. So as it wasn't simply a matter of the nation state that created sort of a national habits and views. There were other factors also involved. But the amount of people that moved and traveled were again, very few, and were confined to, say, the merchant class and or traveling armies, perhaps in those instances. So where first there were the Celtic Gaelic tribes in what today we call England. Then the Romans came. Bear in mind too, there was a lot of trade around the coasts, the east coast of Britain with the west coast of what was then Gaul, that was later invaded by the Romans, but Julius Caesar. So there's a lot of trade there and interaction going back and forth. There's also things like intermarriage, and procreation and so on going on. But then again, the amount of people doing it were very small, a very minor part, and they were easily and quickly integrated into a local village or local social grouping. Then the Romans came, but a relatively small number of Romans came. So it wasn't that Romans arrived by the million or anything. And they're supposed to be, give or take 2 million. The population of England was give or take about 2 million at the time. And then the Romans arrived in relatively small numbers, but as an administrative and military class, and they built roads and put buildings in and created national laws, which all had the effect of creating a national sort of identity or national borders, if you will. Now, when the Romans left, the local tribes started hiring mercenaries, which were the Angles and the Saxons, or the Saxons. And Saxony was a different sort of region in the wider Germanic area than it later became. But so the Saxons came in, and then other areas like the Angles and the Jutes from what today would be Denmark, the Norwegians, and so some of the southern Swedes coming in. So Scandinavian generally, and they were coming in quite decent numbers, and they took over really an area sort of between 50 and 90 miles along from the coast, down that east coast of England, even incorporating parts of Scotland and the islands off the coast of Scotland. So the Scandinavians came there, and it was called the Danelaw. It was considered to be a separate country. So you had really the remnants of the Roman Empire and the Celtic tribes. You had the Anglo-Saxon, the more sort of Germanic tribes. Not there was much difference, by the way, if you look at the interaction in Europe between the Saxons and the Danes, the Utes, and so on. It was quite a lot of interaction. Their languages, well, they weren't the same, but there was a lot of similarity in Southern Danish and Saxon, for example. So we're not talking vast differences here in people's behaviour and language and customs and habits. It'd be quite similar. And also the spreading effect of Christianity, creating commonality there. So anyway, the Danes, so England was divided up. Then the Normans arrived. Now the Normans wanted to put in place a national administration with national laws and central government. And so they went about that rather ruthlessly, by the way, but that created the framework of a national identity, and by the way, the class system that lived in England for. Now the future kings, Norman kings of England, were also involved in. The Welsh tribes were constantly raiding. Into what was England at the time, and so the Norman kings of England then decided they were going to sort of pacify Wales. Ireland at the time was effectively a Danish or Scandinavian. They founded Dublin, the Danes. Was a Scandinavian sort of colony that relied heavily on slavery, and so they were raiding the English coast, Wales, the Welsh coast too, and coming around into Cornwall and willy-nilly grabbing folks as slaves. So that the Norman kings decided they're going to put an end to that. But anyway, it created a national identity or a national boundaries and a national identity. And this, after some civil wars and pushing and shoving and so on, this created the basic framework of the nation state. And now what retarded the English nation state was that the Norman invaders in 1066, they also had extensive regions in France, Normandy and so on. And they also had various islands. The Channel Islands, for example, were originally Norman islands. So this created a constant state of civil war between the emerging sort of French nationalist attitudes and the Normans that couldn't decide whether they were English or French anymore, tried to maintain both the English and the French territories. And eventually they had to decide, no, we're actually English. And they gave up the French territories, which they'd had for many hundreds of years. So anyway, this became so England didn't sort of, if you like, federate into a nation fully until the 1500s. And although the groundwork was very much laid before that, and there were no invasions following 1066. So by the 1500s, really the population had 400 to 500 years to integrate. Now, because the Normans were quite heavy-handed in their administration of things, there was, and killed off anyone that was a troublemaker. This created I wouldn't say an English identity at the time necessarily, but over time, given there was no more migration and given the common laws, the imposition of a common language for courts and legal, a common trading and commercial laws, and so on and so forth. This gradually created the national identity. How long does it take for people to integrate? Now, bear in mind, all these people are white. They're all all West European. They're all Christian, and they all have the same masters and the same laws, this sort of thing. But it still took hundreds of years. And if you look at England today, the variety of accents quickly tell you that these were different, the origins of the original, the people who came there and settled with a numerical advantage in that region or that town, came from different places, and they've merged only after hundreds of years. So even people with similar languages, and again, from the same part of the world who look the same, or pretty much look the same, still the integration took time. So this is when we look at integration. It's not something that happens in 5 minutes. Now, can we look at modern integration? Someone's born in England, but look, there are Chinese people that came to Australia in the gold rush of the 1850s who still live in Chinese enclaves, only marry other Chinese, and they speak a form of pidgin English. Again, even though they've been here and their descendants since the 1850s, they frequently send back to the village of their ancestors for husbands and brides. So after having been in Australia for 170 plus years, these people still don't speak English, still only marry other Chinese, still only hang out with other Chinese, and so on. So, the only white people they're friendly with are the politicians that they bribe, and this sort of stuff. So this is now the same with Indians. You look at Indians that came to a Western country in, Western white country in the 1850s, 1840s. So they're 7 generations. Their English is quite good now, though, but they still send back to the village of their ancestors for husbands and brides. And if you ask any one of them, what nationality are you? I'm Indian. Now that they'll say, so they identify with their genetic origins, not with where they were born. You've been 7 generations Western born, but you say you're Indian. Yep, I'm Indian, and that's it. My children are Indian, and their children will be Indian. End of story. So they're not integrating. They don't identify. Now, when they want to get handouts and goodies and giveaways and they want nice jobs in a white society, then they become English, but only then. And the minute they've extracted the freebies and the whatever they can get out of it, then they're back to being Indian once more. So really, this idea of nationality, where the idea of nationality and national identity was born in an era when people didn't travel, didn't move around. It was born before there was rail, before there was steamships, before there was even long ocean going vessels, really. So this idea of nationality and national identity and so on was related to those times. Now, we look at today when you can travel around the world in less than 24 hours, an unimaginable type exercise years ago in a different era. But you look at how that affects attitudes to national identity. So everyone from the third world wants to go to the first world because it's rich and streets are paved with girls, lots of that, and they want that passport because that passport gives them all the free stuff. It gets the free stuff, guarantees it the free stuff. That's the only way that nationality is perceived by those people. But for the people in the rich white countries, their nationality has become irrelevant because anyone can now be English if they're born there, or Swiss, or supposedly Japanese. But the harsh reality of things is that those people not only don't want to become English or Swiss or whatever, they sneer upon it. They hate the white people. They hate white societies. They hate the values that white societies have. They want the giveaways. They want the free stuff. Oh shit, do we want the free stuff? We want all the handouts and so on. We want to freeload off society, but we don't want to be any part of it. We want to live in enclaves. We want to be multiple. So I don't know if it's possible to become or to have a national identity now based on where you were born. I don't think that's valid anymore. The idea of because travel is so cheap and accessible now, it's easy for the Indian peasant to bring a bride or husband out from the village of their ancestors. That would have been far more difficult and far more expensive, beyond the means of many. But as we've got mass movement of peasants now, rather than mass movement of educated rich elites, then the whole discussion about nationality needs to be, I think, addressed around not just that there are people movements, but the mass of people and the type of people that are being. It's essential that you integrate peasants into society, or just don't bring them in. And that's really the conversation I think we need to have when it comes to nationality. You've been a Tassus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.